if someone has an emotional flashback or a trigger in public, we just see somebody flying off the handle, acting a fool or being an asshole or whatever we think of them given whatever situation, because there's such a lack of trauma knowledge.
You're listening to Now What, a podcast where we celebrate the human spirit by sharing stories of strength and resilience.
For those going through hard times or looking to get inspired to change their own life, we're your hosts, Jen and Tisha.
Hi, and welcome back to Now What. I'm Jen.
And I'm Tisha. Today we are here with Shannon Page, who we found actually through Instagram. She has a fantastic page called @Surviving Childhood Trauma, where she talks about childhood trauma. She interviews other survivors. She shares pieces of her own story. And she's agreed to come on today and talk to us about her story and how she ended up running this page and all that stuff. So thank you.
Welcome,
Yes,
Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Do you want to tell us a little bit sort of about your Instagram page and what you're doing over there? You also have like a website and all of that. So
yeah, so that's actually, I don't even know how to start because there's so many things that are involved in how I came to Instagram. But really the gist of it is 4.5 years ago, I kind of woke up from a couple decade long dissociation, kind of like survival mode, kind of like a lack of connection to my childhood, to my past, always knowing it was there, but never really understanding or feeling the full magnitude of it. So about 4.5 years ago, all of that changed. And maybe in a little bit, we can get into how and what happened. But I began my healing journey. And as a child and all throughout my young adult life, I've always loved to write. So when I started seeing a counselor 4 years ago and I started this healing, starting to learn what trauma was and all this stuff, I started a website on WordPress, just a free website. Mm-hmm. Basically just a public journal for whoever within the WordPress, community wanted to read it. Cause obviously I wasn't paying for it. There wasn't, any high tech, keyword searches or anything like that. And I got this really small little following of survivors, and I would write for 6 months at a time. And then I would just walk away from it completely for 3 or 4 months. And I did this cat and mouse game with writing out my trauma story for the last 4.5 years. And then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, I ended up losing my job. So I went from working all the time and doing this website, kind of in between, to not having a job and being at home. So I decided I was going to start writing again because I had all this free time to do it. And okay, so I went back to my website when I was laid off, when my store was closed. But then when I lost my job, I kind of had this, I went through this really angry phase at how I was so easily tossed out, considering all the work that I had done and how much of my life I had devoted to this company in the year and a half prior. And I made this promise to myself. It was May of last year. And I said to myself and my husband, I said, I'm going to dedicate 1 year of myself the same way that I have done to other jobs and other people to this website and this trauma work and see what can happen from it. And so I started exploring online. How do I go outside of my website, and kind of picking up, do I want to go to Facebook? Do I want to go to Pinterest? And I ended up on Instagram, and I've always had a personal Instagram, but I've never been on that circuit of Instagram for small business and entrepreneurs and personalities and influencers, things like that.
Right.
So yeah, I went back to Instagram. Initially, I was sharing other people's stuff. If you go far enough back in my grid, it's always other people's memes that I would share. And then I don't know, something just changed. I started to connect with survivors in the summer of last year. Botchpan, Save the Innocents is a page that reached out to me. I was telling you about earlier. They're from India. It's an amazing organization that works with children and adults, just educating to prevent childhood sexual abuse, but also they have, they just do amazing work, peer support, all this wonderful stuff. And they reached out to me and asked if I wanted to share my story live. So I said yes. And it was the most terrifying thing I have ever done in my entire life. It was in August of last year.
Was that your first
Um,
time like going live in that kind of capacity to,
yes, it was
wow.
my first time going live, period, ever,
Yes. Okay.
let alone sharing my story like that. I'd
Yeah.
written it and I talked about it in therapy, but that was my first time saying it out loud like that to
Wow.
an audience.
Yeah.
And I do it so easily despite my fear. Like I went into so much detail. I just like, it was like I just needed to tell my story, to just
Mhm.
in detail without a filter in a space that I knew was specifically for that. um and it was so empowering. It was terrifying. I had the worst panic attack afterwards. Like we took off to the sunflower farm afterwards. It was so intense, going through the details like I did. The fear of like my family, all, how would they ever find it, right? But the fear that they were going to find this video, watch this me sharing my story and calling me a liar, that became this real fear. But it was so empowering at the same time. And that was like that pivotal moment for me. I i had already done a couple shares of my story in writing with other organizations. But after that online, I was just like, okay, I can do this too. And from there, everything on my Instagram page just started to change.
Mhm.
And that's kind of how it happened. And from there, I just started to, instead of blogging, I wrote, like a 2,200 character caption and
Right.
then summarized that and turned it into a meme. And that was just kind of how it happened. I always do my journaling in the morning. I'm a coffee lover. And the next thing I knew, Thoughts Over Coffee was born. So,
That's
Yeah.
amazing. And it's so interesting that your first time, like really speaking your story out in a public way was on this live. Um,
Yeah.
I can't, why don't we backtrack a little bit? So 4.5 years ago, you kind
mm,
of woke up out of this like fight or flight, it sounds like dissociated place.
mhm.
What like precipitated that? What like kind of bring us.
Yeah. So I have a lot of trauma in my childhood. My trauma started well before I can remember. So my when I was born, my mom died, and from that point on, I was with my dad. I was with the abusive side of my family. So, um, the whole of my childhood, the trauma, the sexual abuse, the neglect, the abandonment, the trial, the suicide, there's, the estrangement, all of those things. And then, they all led up to, I think it was like 17. I had a couple guardianship changes. I had all these things happen that when I turned 21, I met my first husband. I had my first child. My marriage dissolved. I slammed this door shut, and I just completely forgot about that person behind the door and everything that had happened to her. And I just started on this like single mom survival mode, no time for breakdowns, make sure my child has the best life I can give them. No time for screw ups, get a good job, find a boyfriend, provide a secure and stable life. And so I went into this like autopilot, like comfortably numb mode. And it was a very damaging mode because I spent 8 years in a narcissistic relationship. I was not emotionally available to my child. I projected a lot of my own attachment issues onto my kid in forced relationship, with their father. There was just so many things that I did wrong in those 20 years. It was about 20 years because no, 17. Because then at 29, gosh, my math is so, yeah, because at 29, I left the narcissistic boyfriend, met my husband, and started this new, much different, much more healthy relationship, still in this dissociated mode. And so I started basically down a road of where real reality and my narrative in my head started to not match up,
Mhm.
as my husband, showed me what actual like unconditional love was, and, cheered me on and loved me and gave me all this space to be myself. I started to fall apart inside, I guess, but I didn't really know it was happening. So the way it manifested was our marriage started to cool. And we've had the most amazing relationship. We never fight. We have moments of frustration, you know, we might get a little heated, but we've always had, just even before I started healing, our communication's always been good. So we were together for 7 years before we got married. It was a year into our marriage. All of this was starting to happen. I was starting to not feel myself, right? Like things just weren't happy like they were supposed to be. Intimacy in my marriage was disappearing. We were starting to bicker a lot more. Things were getting cold. I couldn't figure out exactly what was happening. I mean, we had just gotten married. We had just had a baby. Like, things are, you know, are stressful, but they should be so happy right now. And then this one day I noticed he's not wearing his wedding ring, and not knowing what a trigger is, I became extremely triggered. My fears of abandonment, everything that you could possibly think of from a trauma survivor when it comes to codependency, attachment issues, fear of loss, fear of rejection, it all came up. I thought he was going to leave me. We had this huge fight. It lasted like 3 days. I mean, I stopped talking to my husband. I couldn't make eye contact. I didn't want to touch him. I didn't know what was going on or how to fix it. I couldn't even believe that we had gotten there, because it just really felt like it was so sudden. Although now when I look back, it wasn't. And then I was sitting at work. It was like day 2 of this fight, of this like 3 or 4 day fight that we had. I'm sitting at work, and it just suddenly slammed into the front of my brain. I don't know how else to say it. And I literally sat there and was just like saying out loud to myself, there's no way, it can't be that. And I started to Google what the symptoms of childhood sexual abuse in adults, like, I didn't even know really what keywords to use, because I had really no idea what I was looking for. I had no understanding of what it meant to be a trauma survivor, or what it meant to have complex PTSD. At that point in my life, I'd only ever been told I'm depressed and sad, and given antidepressants and stuff if I sought mental health help. So I started I started looking stuff up on Google. I started reading articles. It was like reading my life's story. It was like so surreal. I don't know that I really felt much of it. It was just so kind of numbing the way that it was hitting me. I'd gone to school for social work, so I knew the agencies in my area. I called an agency that I knew specialized in domestic and sexual abuse victims, resources and stuff. So I called there, and the director of the sexual assault and abuse department, like program in the agency, was a graduate who was being supervised for her counseling hours. And I started seeing her every week. She sat with me for like 2 hours a week for 18 months. And that was how it started. It was like all of a sudden my life calmed down, and I had this space to be who I was in a safe environment with my husband, and I didn't know who I was. And it just sent my whole nervous system into red alert. And the next thing I knew, my childhood I probably spent the first 2 years of my healing learning what complex PTSD actually meant for me in my life, and what healing, like what the concept of healing was and what that meant, conceptually, like in the abstract, almost, before I could actually start doing the work that was necessary. Because it's just so, when it really hit, it shakes you at your very foundation. Well, I mean, it just rocks you. So that's how it happened. I went running into that office. The girl that I spoke to there, my first counselor, she introduced me to EMDR therapy, and that's how I found the counselor that I'm with now. I was seeing them both actually for a little over a year weekly, one for EMDR and then the first one for talk therapy. But then my work schedule forced me to choose. So I'm still seeing my EMDR therapist. I've been with her now for over 4 years.
And what is EMDR? Sorry.
EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's based on the concept that trauma is stored in the brain, that children who are stressed out and traumatized don't sleep well, so proper processing doesn't happen, and that's why trauma is kind of stored. It's stored in the brain, and then the body remembers it through the somatic responses and the nervous system responses. And EMDR is a bilateral stimulation technique with focused thought to try and mimic REM sleep in a wakeful state to help process emotions more properly.
Wow. Okay.
So, and for me, it works very well. So I've been a huge proponent of it. It doesn't work for everybody, but I definitely recommend that survivors try it if they're able and if it's available.
Yeah. I've heard both for and against EMDR. Some people swear by it. Some people like, it didn't really work for me. But as you said, if you need to try something, then maybe that's something to try, right?
and there's so many different ways it can be done too. I mean, and you really do have to trust the therapist that you're with, because it is kind of uncomfortable, right? You're sitting in a room with a therapist who's gonna have you close your eyes and kind of guide you through something, and if you're not feeling comfortable and safe and able to relax into the technique, then it's definitely not going to work. And I know for me, my counselor started using her hand in front of my eyes, but that didn't work. And we had to switch to the vibrating paddles because I need my eyes closed or I won't be able to focus any of my thoughts. So we had to adjust it a little bit to make it work.
Right.
And I imagine like when you have a lot of, like you were just saying how it's so important that you trust your therapist. And I think when you've had a lot of trauma, I imagine there's some like trust issues that kind of come with that maybe the trust isn't given as readily, I suppose.
I would say it's either my second or third appointment with my counselor. I had the worst panic attack. I was absolutely certain she thought I was completely crazy, had made it all up. There was no way that someone could have gone through what I had gone through or be so screwed up at my age, after having lived, 30, at that point I was 37 years of functioning adult life. And then all of a sudden I'm just like a heap on the floor. I can barely keep myself showered and get to work. And I was just absolutely certain that the only reason that she was even helping me was because I was paying her through insurance. But I had to push myself through that discomfort and take the logical side of me that knew I was in counseling to help me with this stuff. And I had to talk to her about that. And I actually wrote a piece a year into counseling, and then I revisited it at year 2, called 11 Things Trauma Survivors Need to Know when they start counseling. And the first thing is that, you have to find a counselor that you're comfortable with, that you trust, because they're going to help you through some of the most, intense and painful, embarrassing, shame-filled, whatever, add whatever adjective you want to it, stuff. In fact, I just said to my counselor a couple weeks ago that she is the first person that has given me the space that I've been able to trust, that has, been there for me to deal with this stuff. So it's very important. If you don't feel that after a couple sessions, if you're not starting to feel that connection, it's time to search out another counselor, because you have to trust your counselor. You're not going to be successful.
Yeah. Well, obviously our experiences are all very different, but I definitely interviewed therapists before I started therapy after my husband was killed at work, because I just knew, like I met with somebody who I was like, yeah, you're not my person. Can I get out of here?
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think my counsel, I mean, granted, I don't think that I was ready or had the capacity to really face my childhood in my 20s. I did see a couple different therapists in my 20s, but I also don't think that I trusted them, and that maybe if there had been a connection there, maybe I could have started this sooner. I wasn't really in the best environments in my 20s with the relationships I was choosing. So, there was a lot of elements that really, that made my survival mode necessary for as long as it was.
Right.
But then a lot of elements that really showed up to say, okay, it's time to take the armor off, Shannon, and start dealing with this stuff. So,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And there's so many people walking around, I think, with that armor. And, I reached out to you. I think I found you because I was searching like childhood trauma, and your Instagram handle is surviving childhood trauma. So I found you pretty easily, but it's actually very common that people have childhood trauma.
Yeah.
But it's not always something that people feel that they can share, because I think there is so much like shame wrapped around it. And there's so many, just a multitude of sort of layers that make it hard for people to talk about it.
What I definitely agree. We filter ourselves as childhood trauma survivors, mostly because I think we live in a world that doesn't really can't handle it, right? It's child abuse, especially child sexual abuse, it's so uncomfortable, it's so disgusting and so unsettling for people that, it's a lot of us, we start to share, and then all of a sudden we see this deer in headlights look, and we suddenly want to stop and rewind and take everything back and make everything, I definitely agree with that. But I think even more so, especially now, I'm starting to see more people are talking about it, but what's taboo or what's not being addressed, like one of the things I noticed about the Me Too movement, and and I'm not discrediting it or minimizing it in any way, because it's so important, but Me Too was great for collectively bringing us together as survivors, but it didn't do anything for us when addressing the symptoms of complex PTSD that we all live with, because that's the problem. Like, that's what society can't seem to get a grip. It's like, if someone has an emotional flashback or a trigger in public, we just see somebody flying off the handle, acting a fool or being an asshole or whatever we think of them given whatever situation, because there's such a lack of trauma knowledge that nobody can when somebody is popping off, we can't stop ourselves and say, this isn't about me. Now let me respond to that person's reaction. And I think that's the problem. And that's what I try to do on my page. And maybe that's one of the reasons that, because like my page has grown organically. I never have promoted a post or tried to, do giveaways to like follow my page, kind of like I've never done any of that. My following has grown organically, because I talk about the actual symptoms, not just my story. It's not just about the fact that I am a childhood sexual abuse survivor or that I've gone through XYZ. It's that, no, I'm actually a 41-year-old mother who just on Monday went through an emotional trigger because my father-in-law disrespected a boundary and then rolled his eyes at me when I tried to say, hey, I have this boundary that you're disrespecting. And it just sent me into a spiral that I had to try and control, so that my child doesn't see me losing control, that I'm not putting my husband in an awkward position, and then I'm addressing it and dealing with it in a functioning way, So it's like, that's the stuff that's so important that we don't talk about, or, again, that I'm a 41-year-old woman who, one day I'm out and I'm happy, like you guys see me right now. And then, nobody knows that literally today I changed my shirt, but I'm still in my pajama bottoms, and I probably should have showered this morning, but we've done a lot this week and I've been going through a lot, and I had that trauma thing on Monday. So today I just did nothing, because that's what I needed to do so that my body and my mind can kind of catch up. So that's the stuff, like, I definitely agree. We don't talk enough about our abuse so that it becomes more like it. I don't want to say normalize, because we don't want to normalize abuse, but we need to normalize survivors speaking up, but not just about the abuse, also about the effects.
Yeah. And that's one of the things when we were starting this podcast that kind of came up, was like, you hear these stories of like, oh yeah, so and so was abused, or someone went through this horrible thing and now they're okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or we see these kind of happy endings where it just kind of ends there in the media. Like someone was attacked and now they're better.
Yeah.
Without actually addressing how that attack, let's say, or whatever it was that happened, actually impacted that person long term, and what people have to go through to try and recover from some of these events that happen in their lives. And that's part of like our kind of mission statement, is to try and talk about all of that stuff too.
Yeah.
Because that's where the hard work is like the afterwards. And it's so interesting to me that you just were kind of talking about dissociating, and kind of that was in a box, and that was like a different life. And I'm going to just like do whatever I can to get through. I have a very similar story in that regard. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like maybe my childhood wasn't really normal.
Yeah, it was reconciling. Yeah, it was reconciling the narrative in my head with my reality. Like I had rewritten my story, and not that I'd necessarily rewritten it any differently than what it happened, than what had happened, but I did rewrite it in a softer, more palatable way for myself.
Right.
Yeah. So, just so you can
live with
keep
it.
going.
So you can live with it, so that you can carry that, right?
Just so I can live with it.
Because the weight of some of this stuff is very heavy.
Yeah. And like, and it is, it's very, so, and like, it doesn't go away. Right. Like, I think that's one of the things that I saw when I was kind of reading about, and some of the things that you guys wanted to talk about. You had said one of the questions was kind of like, what's something that you want people to know about complex PTSD? And it would be in this regard, like number one, healing from healing childhood trauma, dealing with complex PTSD is so much grief work. Like it is so much grief work, because there's so much loss and just so much loss.
So much.
And one thing I'm learning as I heal, one thing I want people to know about complex PTSD, and at least for me, and maybe this isn't for every survivor, it's been for most survivors that I've talked to, is that these are a lot of the wounds that we heal that come with the complex PTSD diagnosis, the symptoms, those things, those wounds, they don't ever, I don't think they ever fully completely heal. I really don't. The wounds that we sustain as childhood trauma survivors, as childhood abuse survivors, like for me specifically, it was my grandfather who was molesting me. It was my dad who was protecting him and silencing me. It was my dad who was going to testify at the trial against me. There was so much betrayal in that relationship, like the wounds from, like, how do you heal like that? Yes, I will learn how to carry it. Like that's what I'm learning. I'm learning how to live with that, how to cope with it on days when it's a little bit heavier than others. But 30 years from now, my dad's betrayal is going to hurt just as much as it does now, and just as much as it did when I was 14, and he did it, so yeah, if I wanted anyone to know anything about childhood trauma and complex PTSD and this healing process, it's that it's a lifetime journey, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's what I'm learning, is that the journey is difficult and it's hard to accept sometimes. I get pissed off that it's a lifelong journey, but it does get easier to carry. So
I think there's I've said before on the show, there is like we're very trauma illiterate. You know, there's not, you know, we don't understand trauma. And then when you're dealing with these acronyms like PTSD and CPTSD, they're very offhandedly thrown around by people who don't understand them. Like I won't claim to understand PTSD. I understand deep grief and trauma. You know, and but I think the more we talk about these stories, the more people I hope we build some greater empathy among the people who listen to them. Because you know, obviously you're going to carry that with you 30 years from now, and you're 30 years out from that. Like, obviously this was a formative time in your life, and these were the people that, you know, when you're that young, you're relying on your parents and family to be the people to, you know, protect you and teach you and like be all of the things for you, right? So,
and, you know, I think as a childhood trauma survivor, and if I'm being honest, like I really feel that I was parented also from I was parented by someone who also had their own trauma, right? Like that's part of it, right? Like for me, I'm like, yes, the work is hard, and yes, it's heavy, and yes, it's always going to be there. But I feel like I need to do the work because it has to stop with me.
Yes.
Like that trauma that happened in my childhood, whatever, like it has to stop with me. I can't pass that on and repeat behaviors to my children. Like that for me is a big impetus in terms of like, yeah, it's heavy, but like I have to do this work. And you can't just continue to like live with it in that box.
Right. That's one of my biggest, actually, I have a lot of what we'll call secondary trauma, and it comes from those years of dissociation. Because I actually didn't catch the cycle, right? I had my oldest when I was just shy of 19, and I think he was 18. Yeah, because he's 22 now. So he was like just shy of his 18th birthday when I finally started to actively heal and face my childhood. So I have a 6-year-old who is being raised by a mom who's actively healing and who's, you know, actively working on, you know, my emotional vocabulary and emotional regulation. And I'm addressing all of the different kind of, you know, I'm going to say deficits, you know, like the developmental trauma issues that I have, all the attachment style issues, codependency issues, and the juxtaposition between my two children with regards to emotional awareness and ability to communicate, like at this age now with my 6-year-old to my 22-year-old it's like night and day. For exactly what you're saying, because I'm awake now and I won't ever go back, and I'm moving forward now in healing, and of course I'm now showing up for my oldest and trying to, you know, I can't change the past. I can't, you know, erase the things that have happened or been influenced because of how I was, but I can show up now, and that's what I'm doing. And yeah, you're right. My kids are my biggest, I mean, obviously me and my own healing and happiness and finding my own authentic self is a really huge motivator too. You know, the more I get to know myself, the more I actually think I'm a pretty cool person. So it's like, wow, like who would have thought, you know, but no, my kids they are so amazing, and they are absolutely my motivation to continue doing this. Even though there are plenty of days when I would love to pack this shit up, put it back in a box, file it in the back of my brain, slam that vault door shut again, and pretend like none of this ever happened, because healing is not easy. It's beautiful and it's messy and it's chaotic and it's wonderful and it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and you run like peer support groups too, right?
yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do on Wednesdays.
So I guess in doing that, you've heard so many stories. Does that help with your own healing journey, do you think?
So much. I have leveled up my healing game more in the last year through the survivor community, through the connections with other survivors, through the survivor shows, through my peer support groups. Like I think in almost every episode of Trauma Talk Uncensored with my best survivor friend Tanner, her and I always talk about how our trauma wounds are relational, and so we can only heal them in healthy and safe relationships. That's how we heal a lot of the feelings that we're not good enough, that we're not lovable, that we can't trust ourselves or other people. Like, those things inevitably and naturally heal themselves when we're in safe environments, in safe relationships, surrounded with people that have understanding and space for us to heal and be who we are. My counseling couldn't touch the level of healing that I've gotten from the survivor community. Like I was saying earlier, the relational healing, when I put something up and everybody's just like, I needed to see this today, thank you so much, your story mirrors mine, or whatever they say on a post that I put up, it's like, it's the same for me. It's so reciprocal to know that when I'm having a really bad day or I'm struggling with something, that I can come into a community of people that just understand me without explanation and who can hold that space for me and be there.
Mm-hmm.
100%. Meeting survivors, having that safe space, letting go of that shame and embarrassment with other people because, we feel a little less alone, has done amazing things for my healing. Like, I don't even think I could put into words. It's just been a huge level up. So 100%.
Amazing. Yeah, I think you're doing a lot of good work, just connecting people, healing yourself, helping other people heal. It's really inspiring, actually.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I'm so inspired by you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Really.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Do you have any other plans for what you're doing over there? I'm putting you on the spot, maybe.
I hit it pretty hard and heavy back in February, and then I kind of realized I needed to step back and reassess what I could handle and what I couldn't. Right now, I have the peer groups going. So any of your listeners who would like or who are interested, if they can either go to the link in my bio on Instagram, or they can just go to my website, which is survivingchildhoodtrauma.com. And peer groups are on Wednesdays. I have 2 different time slots. You can sign up. I normally put the groups up monthly. I tend to do them topic focused just because it's easier for us to then come in and have a conversation. I kind of joke that if you ask a trauma survivor, hey, how's it going? How are you feeling? It's like, we look at you like, really, what part of that question do you want me to answer? So,
or how honest do you want me to be?
Yeah, how honest do you want me to be? Exactly. It is pretty laid back, right? Like, I'm not a professional counselor. I'm not licensed. I'm just a survivor who's an expert at my own healing journey. We get into the group and, everybody just kind of shares what their week has been like. And the conversations are often very organic. And it's just really nice. So I do those. I do the Survivor Speak Live series, which is on Mondays, and that's also linked in my bio and on my website. There's no prerequisite or requirements. If you want to be on the show, you simply submit to be on the show because it's a space for survivors to share their story. I do Trauma Talk Uncensored twice a month with Dr. Tanner Wallace, and that's just her and I. I guess it's like a live podcast in a sense. We just get on there and we talk about our highs and lows of the week and do some real talk on trauma. And that's about it. I might eventually, if people keep an eye on my Instagram, it's where I'm most active. I do have a journaling workshop that I have put on the back burner for a little bit, but I might bring back, which has always been fun. So people can just kind of keep an eye. But that's about it. I'm just there every day, except for right now because I'm on vacation. But I'm just there every day sharing my journey. Whatever it may be. Sometimes there's nothing to report. Sometimes there's all kinds of crazy trauma triggers going on. it's you just never know what you're gonna get.
The healing isn't linear, right?
Mm-mm.
And we've
There's
talked about
some
that
breaks,
with
not at all.
grief and in all types of other situations. And I also loved that you said, like, there's no prerequisite, because the reason I love it is that I really do think that there are people who look at trauma and say, oh, well, I wasn't sexually abused, so my childhood wasn't traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't physically abused, so it wasn't traumatic.
It's like,
And we hear these, I was talking with my own therapist, and I was like, you hear these stories of, like, the kid was kept in a cage and was starved to death. And, like, that is
Mm-hmm.
a very traumatic childhood. And when your childhood wasn't that, there can be sort of this idea that we minimize that and say, well, it wasn't that bad, and ignore the ways in which our trauma is actually impacting us daily.
Yeah, I have had, the survivors on my show do not have to be even necessarily abuse survivors. I've had a couple survivors that their traumas were literally like freak accidents in their childhood that caused conflict. One survivor is a burn victim. There was a tragic fire in their home that severely injured her and her siblings, and she lost her parents very young. Another survivor was in a car accident very young and lost, him and his sister were severely hurt, and the friend was killed. And so yeah, trauma is trauma is trauma. If it overwhelmed your brain's ability to cope, it was trauma. If it felt traumatic to you, it was trauma. Yeah, no comparing. My show is literally a space for survivors who identify as survivors, who want to come and talk about their healing, just have a space to talk, because a lot of times we just talk about the struggles with emotions, the struggles with relationships, the struggles with our sense of self and our the way we talk to ourselves and think about ourselves. Because that's all the stuff that makes us feel really lonely. Like, we don't like to talk about it. It's embarrassing. Why would we think those things? Logically, we know they're not true, but our brains won't shut off. So yeah, that show, I'm constantly in awe of it. I'm so honored to be a safe space for survivors. And yeah, it's an honor to have that show, to be a part of that show, to meet everybody. So
you're so humble.
Anybody can.
You're not taking any credit for it. I mean,
back to those trauma terms. Have you heard of imposter syndrome?
Right? There it is, right there.
No, but I am, though. I am so grateful every day for because the work that I do gives my pain purpose. And I think that we all need that in some way, that little bit of purpose for what we've been through, because there's no sense to it. And it's so unfair. There's just no sense to what we've been through, with the traumas that we've all experienced, whatever they are. So yeah. And again, I just love meeting people. It's like, I think it was innate in me to fall into this role. I love to write. I wanted to be a counselor. It just all kind of meshed into this Instagram personality, and it all works.
Yeah,
it definitely works.
It's working. You're killing it over there. So thank you for being on the show with us, and for providing that space, and for sharing with us here, and just helping people, really.
Oh, of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. Life is good. I was meant to be on this path, so I'm here, and I'm grateful to be here. So, and thank you guys so much for having me. It's always so fun to meet other survivors and just be able to share my story and talk about this stuff. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and you truly, you're very inspiring, and we will share all of the ways that you can connect with Shannon in our show notes. Yeah, thank you so much for all you do.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Now What. If you've enjoyed this episode, leave us a review. Your ratings and reviews help more people like you find our podcast.
Don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with someone you think would love it. And make sure to find us on Instagram at nowwhat_podcast. Until next time, we're Tisha and Jen. Remember, your hard times are the chance to write another chapter.